This is my usual week off, but I do have an episode for you today. I always say if you want more content, go to Patreon, go to Apple subscriptions, and there is more there. But I have had comments over the years where people have said that when they do subscribe to some podcasts, Patreon feeds, they find that the content there isn't the same as the main feed content. It's not either the same format or it's not as good. And so they don't really feel like they're getting what they want, which is more of their podcast. So to kind of illustrate what you get with the Crime Lines Patreon episodes and the Apple subscription episodes, I wanted to go ahead and put one in the main feed. And you can see it really is just more Crime Lines. The episodes generally vary from 25 to 40 minutes, sometimes longer. I can't really remember any of them being shorter than that for sure, but, don't hold me to that. So enjoy this Patreon episode, totally free to you. The only difference between what you hear today and what you would hear on Patreon is I will put ads on this one. The show is ad-supported. Everything on Patreon and Apple subscriptions is ad-free. If you sign up, you get all the regular episodes ad-free, and then, obviously, the bonus content's ad-free. Anyway, thank you for supporting my content, no matter where you get it, when you get it, how you get it, and also thank you for considering supporting me on Patreon or Apple subscriptions. Here's the episode. When Jane Bashara was found dead in what looked like a carjacking, the police zeroed in on her husband as a suspect. The problem was he had a rock-solid alibi. A man came forward to put the pieces together, but Jane's husband's private life was what would take this case from tragic to sensational. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crime Lines. Welcome to this month's Patreon and Apple subscriber bonus episode. I want to thank everyone for their support of Crime Lines. I know that some people support the show kind of as a tip jar, and others do it for the extra content, probably the ad-free content. And I have been working to try to make this bonus content a little bit less of a mini episode every month and include more full-length episodes like this one. This month, we are discussing the case of Jane Bashara, a Michigan mother of two. At the time of the murder, Jane had been married for over 20 years to her husband, Bob. The two met in 1983 when 28-year-old Jane Engelbrecht was at a party and immediately caught the eye of 26-year-old Bob Bashara. Bob saw how outgoing she was, loving and kind, and said that he immediately wanted to spend more time with her. Jane had grown up in the Mount Clemens area in Michigan, one of 4 children in a close-knit family. In high school, Jane excelled in academics and in sports, playing both tennis and volleyball. After she graduated, she went to Central Michigan University and had a typical college experience for someone as level-headed but outgoing as Jane was. She joined the Honor Society, she was in a sorority, and she eventually took an internship that led to a full-time job when she graduated with her bachelor's of business administration. She went on to get her MBA in 1983, which was right around the same time she met Bob. Bob had grown up in Grosse Pointe, which is a suburb of Detroit. Grosse Pointe itself is a city, but it also refers to that entire coastal area along the lake just north of Detroit. It's known for being an affluent area with multiple cities that are all primarily residential, and they all have names like Grosse Pointe something. Grosse Pointe Woods, Grosse Pointe Park, you get the idea. Growing up, Bob was a difficult child. He was in and out of trouble, but he had a certain amount of charm that let him get out of it every so often, and I'm sure it did not hurt that his father was a judge. But then Bob did something pretty big. As a preteen, he set his grandmother's mattress on fire. It doesn't sound like anyone got hurt, but his family realized that Bob needed more discipline, so they sent him to Howe Academy in Indiana. This was an expensive, tuition-based, military-style school. He attended Howe for middle school, and for those outside of the U.S., that's roughly ages 12 to 14. Bob was back in time to attend Grosse Pointe North High School. Afterwards, he pursued a degree in economics and communication. While he was at college, Bob met a woman named Priscilla, and around the time he graduated, when he was 23, he and Priscilla got married. This marriage was short-lived. It lasted no more than a year. According to Bob, they were just too young when they got married, and his ex-wife was just not ready to settle down. After the divorce, Bob and his father went into business together. Bob's uncle owned a restaurant already, so their first new business was to expand that restaurant brand to a second location. They then bought another property not to run a business out of, but to rent it out. And then Bob bought another property and another one, and eventually his job was basically a full-time landlord. Most of the buildings Bob bought were commercial, but some did have apartments or lofts above them that he would rent out to tenants. Bob already had his business established when he met Jane. After about 2 years of dating, the two married in Grosse Pointe Woods in April of 1985. They then had 2 children, a boy in 1988 and a girl in 1992. In between the births of these 2 children, they bought a 5-bedroom home in Grosse Pointe Park, which is a town of about 12,000 people, and it is the closest of their Grosse Pointe communities to Detroit, which really helped with Jane's commute into the city for work. She was a corporate executive in marketing. The two were financially successful, and they spread that out into their community. They organized multiple charity events over the years, including annual events. They volunteered regularly. Bob Bashara was the neighborhood Santa every Christmas, and they had all the appearances of success. But that did not last forever. After about 15 years or so of marriage, they were having issues with their sex life. Bob had erectile dysfunction, but he was still interested in sex. Jane appeared to have a waning interest in sex, and the intimate activities that Bob found stimulating and fulfilling were outside of Jane's comfort zone. They fall solidly under the category of BDSM, specifically dominance and submission, with Bob being the dominant one. By 2002, after 19 years together and 17 years of marriage, Bob started seeking out extramarital relationships within the local BDSM community. According to him, Jane was aware of this in a broad sense. He said Jane basically told him that he could do whatever he needed to in order to be happy, but warned him to be discreet so as to not embarrass her or the family. They didn't speak about this in any detail, so Jane did not know the specifics about what Bob did, where he did it, or how many people he did it with. If Jane did ask for details, and if Bob provided them truthfully, she would have learned that Bob had set up a space in the basement of a property he owned. It was referred to as a sex dungeon, where he would bring submissive women. He also brought women into the home while Jane was not there for group sex, because, according to him, the bed was bigger and there was a shower for people to use. While Bob would end up having a longer-term relationship in all of this, most of his encounters were casual. This was a part of Bob's life that was unknown to his friends and his family, who knew him as a husband, a dad, the president of the Rotary Club. And it would surprise people that Jane, a senior marketing manager who had been active in parenting groups and school groups and in the wider community, would be on board with this husband who she mostly financially supported, entertaining other women. When, down the road, people found out about this, many believed Jane knew nothing about Bob's affairs at all, that he was fully cheating on her, and had she known, she would have divorced him. Bob met most of the women on BDSM message boards and websites. His username was Master Bob, and he was clearly portraying himself as a dominant looking for a submissive. His profile said he was a true master who could open people up to what life has to offer and train them in all they seek to understand, learn, and know. And one thing Bob meant by this, according to him, was teaching boundaries. Bob said it was through being the dominant partner that he learned some women had been abused by others under the guise of BDSM. So he said he used his role to teach them about enforcing boundaries and rules and having healthy relationships. This is, of course, according to Bob. Many people who are in the BDSM community or practice BDSM in their intimate lives don't necessarily want to go to the media to contradict something Bob Bashara said to them. However, we do have on record at least one person who has said that what happened to her crossed the line. We will get into it a little bit more later. But even without that, there is reason to doubt Bob Bashara because he wasn't generally honest with the women he met. He would usually say he was single, either widowed or divorced, depending on who he was talking to. Bob said he would tell women this to keep his family life private and to keep a wall between his two lives. But if Bob actually respected those women and wanted them to understand healthy boundaries, he would have engaged with them honestly about his relationship status so they could make informed consent. Now, if a woman would find out he was actually married with children, the story would change to how he and Jane were all but divorced, and they were just waiting for the kids to grow up and move out before making it official. And that story was also not true. Bob later said he never intended to divorce Jane, and he wanted to remain married to her regardless of what he did outside of the marriage. And Jane, who had confided in her sister about actually wanting a divorce, also said she was not going to pursue it. Because in addition to other issues in the marriage, Jane and Bob began having some serious financial issues, especially after the 2008 economic downturn. Bob was a landlord and property values were rapidly dropping. Buildings he bought a year before weren't worth what he paid for it. And tenants were losing their jobs, businesses were going under, and people weren't paying their rent. This only added to the stressors in the marriage. Jane had a sizable retirement account and hoped to retire early, but they couldn't afford it now. Bob had these mortgages. Some had improvement loans on top of that. Bob claimed he had a handle on it. He was moving money and investments from property to property. But in reality, he was just not turning enough of a profit to support the family, especially while they helped their kids pay for college. While Jane herself, if she was a single woman, may have been financially stable, she realized in a divorce, it was going to get financially complicated. She didn't want to end up with half of Bob's real estate debt, lose half of her huge retirement account, and then start over in her 50s. So Bob didn't want a divorce, and Jane didn't want the fallout of a divorce, so they stayed married. It was in 2008, after 23 years of marriage and several years into Bob having relationships Outside of his marriage, he started an affair with 48-year-old Rachel Gillette. Rachel, like many others, did not know he was married at first. She broke things off with him when she found out about Jane, but then they got back together, and then they broke up, and then they got back together. Unlike the other women in Bob's life, this seemed to not just be a physical relationship. And so when she would break things off, Bob would woo her back, promising a life together. Bob told her over the next 3 years of this on-again, off-again relationship that he was going to divorce Jane. He and Rachel were going to buy a house together, and Rachel was going to be the primary partner in the relationship, even though they planned on bringing in another woman into a triad. According to what Bob told Rachel, if he had 2 submissive women at home, he wouldn't need all these casual relationships with women he met online. Eventually, Bob told Rachel that his divorce was final in June of 2011, and it was time for them to start house hunting. They had an offer accepted on a house in Grosse Pointe Park with a closing date of January 27, 2012 on the books. Part of the deal with the new house was that they could finally bring in this third partner who Bob had been actively looking for. Bob met a woman named Janet in November 2011 online, and she was told by Bob that he and Rachel wanted her to move into their house together. Bob flew out to see her in Oregon on January 12, 2012, to visit her for a few days, telling his wife Jane that he was at a sales seminar. According to Janet, during this visit, Bob violated her boundaries repeatedly. He caused her extreme pain, and she even passed out during what was initially consensual choking that he didn't stop when he should have. She said she wanted to kick him out of her house, but Bob was a big guy. He was 6'3" and 265 pounds. She was afraid of him. So Janet just tried to placate him for the couple of days until his flight back to Michigan. She said that while he was at her house, he was repeatedly on the phone with a handyman demanding that some work get done. When Bob got back to Michigan, he continued to text Janet daily, even though she was trying to pull back on the relationship. Meanwhile, Rachel was looking forward to closing on that house with Bob, but she was a little nervous. On January 20th, a week ahead of the closing, Rachel sent Bob an email. She wanted to see the papers proving Bob's divorce was final. Before she signed on the dotted line and committed to a house with Bob, she wanted to be sure. Bob could not have sent these papers to her because they didn't exist. A few days later, on the 24th, Bob picked up the closing packet for the house from the realtor and dropped off some paperwork he needed to get to her. The real estate agent double-checked that Bob had the money ready because he was not using a traditional lender, getting a mortgage, that sort of thing. Usually when that happens, you have the mortgage broker also communicating and providing paperwork. But Bob had other properties to leverage and income streams, and it's not uncommon for someone in the real estate business who has multiple properties to be paying essentially cash for a property. He told the agent that he had most of the money already and he would definitely have the rest of it by the time they closed in a few days. They scheduled a final walkthrough of the house for the day of closing, and Bob left. It was 8.5 hours after that meeting that Bob called the police. It was around 11:30 at night, and he said that he and his wife Jane were supposed to meet at home that evening to discuss their taxes, but she never made it. He had been waiting for hours, and he was worried and wanted to report her missing. Over the next several hours, Bob called friends and family, including the couple's children, to see if they knew where Jane was and to let them know that she was missing. He even called his girlfriend Rachel. In those overnight hours, the police were pretty quickly able to build a timeline for Jane for that day. She had been at work, and she attended a meeting in downtown Detroit. She left around 4:30 in the afternoon, presumably to drive home. And while that was the last time Jane Bashara was seen, it wasn't the last time someone talked to her. On her drive home from work, Jane talked to her daughter on the phone all the way up until she arrived at the house. She told her daughter she would call her back once she was inside and settled in, but she never did. Bob came home at around 8 p.m., expecting to find Jane home. He assumed she had just run out for something since her car was also gone. He waited, but after 3 hours with no word from her, he called the police. So between 4:45 when Jane hung up with her daughter until 8 p.m. when Bob got home, Jane had, for some reason, gotten back into her vehicle and left the house. The question was, where did she go? And did she go there willingly? They got the answers to those questions less than 8 hours after Jane was reported missing. Around 7 in the morning, a tow truck driver spotted a black Mercedes SUV parked in an alley in Detroit. The car stuck out for being far too nice of a car to be tucked away in an alley like that, and the truck driver suspected it was stolen. He called the plate number in to see if it had been reported, and it came back not stolen, but as belonging to a missing person. The police were immediately dispatched to the scene. As the police approached the car, an officer shined his flashlight into the back seat, and there he saw the bloodied body of 56-year-old Jane Bashara. Officers were then sent to the family home to inform them that Jane's body had been found, while other officers processed the scene. It was obvious from the start while they were at that alley that this was only one of the crime scenes they were looking for. The alley where Jane's body and vehicle were dumped were not where she was killed. The amount of blood in the SUV made it unlikely that she was killed in there, and there was a leaf stuck to her sock, but the alley had no leaves around. There was a secondary location somewhere, and since Jane was last known to be arriving at the family home, it was possible she was killed there. And if Jane was killed at her home in Grosse Pointe Park, this would be the first murder there in nearly 20 years. And in that slaying, there was a clear motive. The victim, Phyllis Leonard, was struggling with two men at a bus stop who were trying to steal her purse. One of the men then shot her right through her heart, killing her nearly instantly. It took a few years to solve it, but one of the men was arrested and convicted in the crime. Unlike that crime, there was no obvious motive for the murder of Jane Bashara. The vehicle had been left unlocked with the keys on the floor by the driver's seat. Jane's purse was tossed out on the floor on the passenger side, but it's not clear what a killer would have been looking for. If it was a robbery, well, they passed up her checkbook, her cell phone, and her medication. It looked more like the bag was tossed to make the police think robbery was the motive. Even leaving the car in an alley in Detroit, away from her home, felt staged. If not for the call with her daughter, they wouldn't have known Jane got home that day. It would have looked like something happened to Jane in Detroit after work, possibly a carjacking. But thanks to that phone call, they knew they needed to investigate much closer to home. On January 26, 2012, the day after the body was found, the police sat down with Jane's husband, Bob, for a full interview. They wanted to know his movements for the time between when Jane left work on the 24th until her body was found on the morning of the 25th. Bob said that he was at one of his rental properties during the evening hours, and he had gone home at some point to pick up some keys. He wasn't home very long before he left again. He didn't come home for good until 8 p.m., and like I said, he was surprised Jane wasn't there. Bob waited over 3 hours for Jane, who was always reliable, and then he called the police. He said he spent the rest of the night at the house calling friends and family and worrying about his wife. He was still home and upset when the police informed him of her death. Obviously, the detectives followed up on this alibi. They found a number of people who saw Bob at the Hard Luck Lounge that evening after 5:15. The bar was on the first floor of one of his properties. Pulling cell phone records, they found Bob's cell phone in the area of the lounge between 4:52 and 5:20. Then at 6:26 p.m., Bob's phone pinged off a tower near his house. And then the next time it hit a tower, it was heading back towards the Hard Luck Lounge. This is in line with what Bob said happened. He was at the building, he ran home to grab some keys, and then he left again shortly after. But here's the thing. Jane's phone also used the same cell tower near the home starting at 4:40, and it was still pinging there at the same time Bob's phone did around 6:30. And around the same time Bob's phone left the home area, so did Jane's. Except hers traveled in a different direction than his, north towards the highway. Then it pinged as it traveled to Detroit, and from 8:42 p.m. on, her cell phone connected with one tower, the one nearest to where her body was found the next morning. And all of these pings on Jane's cell phone were from incoming calls. She did not make any calls after arriving home. So what this looks like is that Bob went to the home at approximately the same time Jane was last known to be there, likely being attacked or abducted. They knew that Bob didn't drive and dump Jane's body. His alibi was too airtight for that. If Bob was involved, he had an accomplice. Then again, this could have been just a coincidence in timing. These are cell towers, not GPS coordinates. Bob was likely within a mile of the house at the same time Jane was within a mile of the house. The police couldn't say for sure that the two were there at the same time. It was possible that Bob got to the house shortly after Jane's SUV drove away, and that this was just a coincidence in timing. But it would have been a pretty big coincidence. The police asked Bob Bashara to take a polygraph test, and he agreed. It was to be performed on the 27th. The questions would not just be, did you kill your wife? But also, did he know what had happened to her? Because whether Bob murdered Jane or not, he certainly did not drive her body to Detroit that evening. All of the evidence places him at the Hard Luck Lounge during that time. In the meantime, Jane Bashara's autopsy was conducted. It was determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Her windpipe had been fractured, which is not a common injury, even in a strangulation. The windpipe is cartilage, not bone. Think about when someone breaks their nose. They don't mean that lower part made of cartilage. They mean the bony part, because bones are so much easier to break. Think about the force of an attack necessary to break the cartilage of someone's nose, and that's the force used on Jane's neck. Though this was the cause of death, it was not the only serious injury. Jane had been hit in the head multiple times, and the injuries could have been from a fist or an object. Jane also had broken fingernails and bruises all over her upper body, front and back, which are clear signs Jane tried to fight back and get away from her attacker. After the autopsy, Jane's body and her clothes were sent to the funeral home, which would later become an issue because her clothes should have gone to the crime lab for processing. Even if the crime lab collected them from the funeral home later, we would still have an issue with possible contamination and maybe even chain of custody. But we didn't have that issue because the police never got her clothing back and they never processed it. The day after autopsy on January 27th, Bob took that polygraph and he failed it. He was named a person of interest and the Bashara home was searched and computers seized. Remember when I said Bob used websites to meet women on the BDSM message boards? That's what the police were about to find. And with that, they had their motive. Bob wanted to be free of his wife, to move on with a secret life, but a divorce would cost him. He was too dependent on Jane's income. And there was that retirement account. Jane didn't want to split it in the event of a divorce. It was worth $800,000. That money would more than pay for the new house and lifestyle Bob wanted. But a day or two after this failed polygraph, Bob Bashara told the police that there was someone else who had a motive. In a letter he directed his attorney to write and send, Bob told the police to look at a man named Joseph Goetz as a person of interest. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Bob and Joseph had what were characterized in the letter as, quote, threatening or bothersome interactions. The letter said that there were veiled threats made against Bob, threats he didn't take seriously at first. But then Joseph Goetz called Bob and started ranting about Jane's death, and Bob thought the police should know. A couple of days after the letter, Bob's attorney set up a private polygraph examination. The good thing with these private exams is that the defense does not have to release the results if they don't want to. So there really isn't a lot to lose here. And his attorney said he passed on the key questions of, did you kill your wife, and did you have anything to do with the death of your wife? After releasing the results to the media, the attorney said that the inconsistency between the two examinations could have to do with how the questions were worded and the experience of the examiners. He said if they wanted to have a battle of polygraph examiners, the police could bring it on. He was confident their test was more accurate. But this case wouldn't come down to polygraph examiners anyway. Those reports were not admissible in court, and the police ended up with something better. They ended up with a confession from a co-conspirator. On January 31st, the Joseph from that letter Bob wrote came forward. His name wasn't Joseph Goetz, but rather Joseph Gens. He turned himself into the police saying he wanted to confess to a murder. Joseph had gone in after his friend talked him into it. Weeks or even months prior to Jane Bashara's murder, Joseph had asked this same friend to help him murder someone. He said no, and he blew off whatever Joseph was going on about, but then he found out Joseph actually killed the person himself. He convinced Joseph that he had to go forward, and he even went with him to the police station. Joseph was taken into an interrogation room where his statement could be recorded, and I will say that Joseph's exact story of what happened did not remain consistent with retellings. So let's get as close to the truth as possible here. Joseph's basic story was that he was at the Bashara home and he killed Jane in the garage. He then put her body into the vehicle and drove it to the alley in Detroit. In one version of the story, Joseph said Bob was in the garage with him and literally forced him to kill Jane at gunpoint. In another version of the story, which is probably closer to the truth, he said Bob did threaten him, but also promised money, jewelry, and even a Cadillac in exchange for this murder for hire. Based on Joseph's confession, the police did hold him for 72 hours, but then they released him. A confession is only as good as the evidence supporting it, and at that point, they just didn't have the evidence to back up Joseph's story. They were still processing the forensic evidence from the Bashara home and garage at that point. And the statement, of course, made them really prioritize that garage. Blood was found in the garage, and one drop of it showed that it was a mixed sample. The contributors were Jane and an unknown male. When they tested that unknown male profile against Joseph Gens, it was a match. This was what they needed, and Joseph was then arrested in early March and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The police then had to link Bob Bashara to Joseph, and they knew that the two men did know each other. They met in the fall of 2011 when a mutual friend named Steve introduced them. Joseph needed two things, a job and a place to stay. Steve knew Bob had a lot of properties, but while Bob couldn't give Joseph an apartment, he was able to refer him on to a friend who could. Bob then hired Joseph for some odd jobs on his properties. We're talking general handyman stuff. That was their primary connection to each other. It wasn't very strong, and Bob had actually pointed the finger at Joseph in that letter, though he did misspell his last name. So why would Bob point out his hitman to the police if he had hired him? Why would he offer that up? I mean, Joseph said Bob was involved, but generally the word of a co-conspirator alone is not enough to support a conviction. And Joseph's word may not have even been enough to support his own conviction because Joseph had been disabled by a stroke at birth. The judge ordered Joseph to be evaluated to see if he was even competent enough to stand trial. Joseph's developmental disabilities had been noted from when he was quite young, and at the age of 7, he started attending a residential school for developmentally disabled children. He lived there during the week and went home to visit on the weekends. So this was a very intensive program. By the time he graduated high school, his educational mastery was no higher than a 5th grade level in some areas, but as low as 3rd grade in others. On top of this, in his 30s, Joseph was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and was described as easily agitated with periods of paranoia. So there is documented reasoning here for the judge to want to order some tests. But these evaluations do not happen overnight, and while the process was happening behind the scenes, the police continued to investigate Bob and any potential role he had in his wife's murder. This included searching his girlfriend Rachel's house, though Bob insisted to the media that Rachel was just a friend. But we do have evidence on his computer and the house sale, which obviously fell through, that were telling us otherwise. Rachel was pretty overwhelmed by this entire situation, and she ended up filing for a protection order against Bob in April, after he refused to stop contacting her when she broke things off after Jane's murder. She wrote in her application that she was scared of Bob and she was worried that things would escalate. particularly if she ended up being called to testify in any legal proceedings. The application for the restraining order included information about their 3-year relationship. Bob eventually had to admit publicly that he was in an open marriage, something Jane's family said was unlikely to be true. I said Bob had to admit this publicly, but really he didn't have to. Prime suspects in cases regularly turn down interviews, but Bob chose to do a number of them, as though public opinion mattered to him. He continually denied involvement in Jane's murder and said that they were not headed to a divorce. They had even gone to marriage counseling a year before to work things out, and they were happy in their unconventional marriage. Bob said he believed Joseph Gens had killed Jane because of a disputed utility bill. Joseph had paid $600 on an electricity bill that he believed Bob was responsible for, but Bob wouldn't pay it. And in the weeks before Jane was killed, Joseph was getting pushier and pushier about it. The theory was that Joseph had turned up at the house, possibly to target Bob, but found Jane instead. After killing Jane, he realized his best bet at making a deal would be to implicate Bob as the mastermind. What is a little odd about Bob pushing this narrative publicly was that at the same time he was doing that, 2 people said Bob was actually behind the scenes, trying to get them to call in tips to the police that pointed away from Joseph. Bob's public stance and private views did not seem to align. It is clear, though, that Joseph was a threat to Bob Bashara. He implicated Bob in this murder for hire. If he wasn't found fit to stand trial, though, it wasn't really going to matter. His confession wouldn't have any credibility in building a case against Bob if it couldn't even be used in trial against him. But if he was found competent, which was the likely outcome, he could cut a deal and testify against Bob. In June of 2012, while these evaluations were still pending, Bob started telling people that he wanted Joseph killed to avenge Jane's death. But then he told their mutual friend Steve that he knew he would be in trouble if Joseph was deemed competent. He told Steve he wanted Joseph killed, and he offered to pay him to do it. Steve went to the police with this, and they asked him to wear a wire and try to get Bob to repeat the offer for the sake of this recording. Steve agreed, and Bob took the bait. He again offered to pay Steven $2,000 to kill Joseph Gens. Using this recording, Bob was arrested and charged with solicitation of murder. And then Joseph was deemed competent to stand trial. Bob ended up pleading guilty to the solicitation of murder charge in October 2012, a month before his trial on that charge was to start. He called it foolish to try to hire someone to kill the man who killed his wife. He portrayed it almost as being set up by Steve, like he hadn't initiated the conversation to start with. But regardless, in December 2012, Bob Bashara was sentenced to 6.5 to 20 years in prison. That gave the investigators more time with Bob behind bars to build a case against him for Jane's murder. The same month Bob pleaded guilty to the solicitation charge, Joseph pleaded guilty to the murder charge, but he made a deal. Rather than first-degree murder, he pleaded out to second-degree murder and would serve 17 to 28 years in prison. In exchange for this deal, he had to agree to testify truthfully in any additional legal proceedings. Of course, those additional legal proceedings were intended to be the prosecution of Bob Bashara. The investigators were building their case, and they spoke with multiple people who said Bob was asking around from about August 2011 until January 2012, trying to find someone who could take care of a tenant. He said the woman was just making his life miserable, and the police were wondering in hindsight if this tenant was code for his wife, Jane. In a little bit of circumstantial evidence to support this, in the same time period, Joseph was also asking for help doing a job for his friend Bob. Bob wanted his wife killed in exchange for some money and a car, and Joseph initially planned it to be a hit and run. These friends of Joseph's did have some details that made police believe that it was Jane. Things like how she was an exec who worked downtown, that she usually left work around 4:30, that her last name was Bashar, which obviously sounds pretty close to Bashara. It sounds so close that I probably didn't even need to point it out. But then there were some pretty specific things that happened in January 2012, before and after the murder, that put more pieces together, circumstantially at least. Early in the month, Joseph mentioned to his landlord that he would be coming into some money soon. The day after Jane's body was found, on the 26th, a witness saw Bob at a thrift store where Joseph volunteered. He gave one of Joseph's coworkers an envelope and said it was payment for a job, and asked if they could give it to Joseph. Now, Joseph did do odd handyman jobs for Bob at various properties, but Bob's wife was found dead the day before. Why was paying a handyman that high on his priority list? People who knew Joseph also noticed that he had a lot of money on him in this time period, around $800 or $900 in cash. He also had an expensive cell phone. Being a general handyman who barely made it paycheck to paycheck, it really stood out to people that he had these things. On the other hand, in fairness to Bob, he had told the police that Joseph had been bothering him about money. He went as far as to say that may have been a motive in the murder. So it's possible, maybe, that he paid Joseph in the hopes Joseph wasn't going to kill him next. But on the other hand, yes, we have three hands today. Why would Bob pay him that money if he suspected he killed Jane, and then tell the police to go look at him as a possible suspect, rather than just tell the police in the beginning and get protection? It honestly was not looking good for Bob Bashara, and in April of 2013, 1 year and 3 months after Jane's death, he was charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, solicitation to commit murder, witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, suborning perjury during a capital trial, and a felony weapons charge. The last two charges were eventually dismissed. Bob's trial was scheduled to begin in October 2014, and 2 weeks before it, Joseph motioned to withdraw his own guilty plea. If granted, this would mean he would not have to testify in Bob's trial, and he would then start preparing for his own murder trial. However, this motion was denied. The state's case was that Bob hired Joseph to kill Jane so he would get her money for his house where he would live with the various women in his life, the ones he referred to online as his slaves. To prove the various elements of the crime, it took several weeks with over 70 witnesses. Jane's sister testified about how Jane would have gotten a divorce if it wouldn't have ruined her financially. And Bob and Jane's adult daughter testified much to the same. Jane had told her she didn't want to lose half of her 401k and still be on the hook for Bob's debts related to the properties. If she could find a way to make a clean break, keep her money, and not be tied to Bob's business, she would do it. And really, this was the answer to that age-old question of why kill the wife and not just divorce her. It's because Jane would have fought handing over money to Bob. And why settle for half or less if you could have all of it? Bob's defense was that Joseph acted alone, so the state had a number of witnesses, including Bob's girlfriend Rachel, testify that they never heard Bob mention Joseph at all. If he had been threatened by him, harassed for weeks over money, surely he would have confided in someone, mentioned it to someone, probably Rachel, but he didn't. They also had witnesses testify not to dismantle Bob's alibi, but to show how far he went to make sure he was seen that night. When Bob left the Hard Luck Lounge and headed home, supposedly to pick up keys, he told the bartender that he was going out, but he would be right back. The state believed this trip wasn't to pick up keys, but rather to make sure Jane was dead. When Bob came back to the lounge about an hour later, he made enough of an entrance that the bartender noticed him. So the strange thing here was that Bob had never before told this bartender about his comings and goings, and it wasn't information she needed for any reason. The one and only time he made sure his movements were noticed by the bartender was the night he just so happened to need an alibi. A tenant who lived above the Hard Luck Lounge also testified that she saw Bob sweeping the lot behind the building on the evening of January 24th. That was not a task she had ever seen him do before, so it stuck in her mind. When she saw Bob later on, after she learned about Jane's death, he even asked her if she saw him that night. When she confirmed she did, he said that he didn't kill his wife and he was really hoping he wasn't going to go down for it. With this long parade of witnesses, you may be surprised to hear that one person who did not testify for the state was Joseph Gens. In the end, he refused to testify unless he got a reduced sentence, which is something he already got. He committed premeditated murder, and he could have been sent away for life if he was convicted of first-degree murder. So the state had him plead down to second-degree murder, so his sentence was a less because they reduced the charge. But that is not how he saw it. And defendants, like Joseph Gens, are the reason some jurisdictions will delay sentencing until after the person cooperates at trial. We saw that happen for years in the Sequoia Vargas trial, and we just saw it in the Jen Shaw case, where her assistant pleaded guilty months ago, but he was not going to be sentenced until her case was resolved because part of his deal was he would testify if she went to trial, which she didn't. She decided to plead guilty at very nearly the 11th hour. But they didn't do that here. It's possible they didn't delay sentencing because Bob hadn't even been arrested at the time Joseph had pleaded guilty. Maybe they trusted he was going to follow through with what he promised. Either way, Joseph was no help to the state at this point. The defense's case was that the police had tunnel vision and that there were other suspects to be looked at, including the theory that Joseph Gens acted on his own. They also brought up the issues with Jane's clothing and that they never got them to the crime lab. There may have been blood or hair evidence that would have helped exclude or include other suspects. Bob did not testify in his own defense. He later said he wanted to, but he followed his attorney's advice not to. In December 2014, the jury took the case and found Bob Bashara guilty of all charges. He was then sentenced to life in prison for the more serious charges and between 1 and 40 years on the lesser charges. A year after Bob's conviction, Joseph Gens decided now was a good time to speak and change his story again. According to him, he couldn't live with the knowledge that Bob had been wrongfully convicted. He signed a sworn affidavit with this new story. In this version of the story, Joseph claimed that the day before he turned himself in for Jane's murder, the police did a sit-down interview with him. In that interview, Joseph told them that he went to Bob's house on the 24th to steal something. Bob owed him some money from a few jobs he had done and was refusing to pay. So Joseph thought he'd break in and take something of equal or greater value. When Joseph broke in through the garage, he unexpectedly encountered Jane. He said seeing her there made him lose it, and he started to strangle her. She fought back, so he hit her on the head until she passed out. Then he strangled her again to make sure she was dead. He put her body in the back of the SUV and drove her to that alley. After Joseph told the investigators this story, according to his new affidavit, they pressured him into going with their story and implicating Bob Bashara in the murder. He said he agreed to this, but he needed to go home first and settle things because he knew that this meant he was going to prison. The investigators agreed, and that's what he did. Joseph left and voluntarily came back the next day and pretended it was the first time he was coming forward. Then he gave the story about Bob soliciting the murder. For the 3 days the police held Joseph after the second statement, Joseph said that they were coaching him on what to say. He said he was promised a 5-year sentence if he would testify that Bob orchestrated the murder. They even told him the district attorney had already signed off on it. They didn't want Joseph. They wanted Bob Bashara, and the police told him that they had been after him for a long time, even before Jane was murdered. Why were they after Bob Bashara? Joseph said they told him that's all he needed to know. But there is a previous accusation in Bob's past that gives this the ring of truth. Bob had been accused in the mid-1990s of sexual abuse of a child. He passed a polygraph, and no charges were filed in the case. However, it seems the chief of police leaned towards believing the alleged victim, and that same chief was directing this murder investigation. So if Joseph's story was true, this is probably what was meant by them having been after Bob for a while. But that's if the story was true, and Joseph later said it wasn't at all. He said another inmate had written the affidavit for him, thinking it would help Joseph get a reduced sentence. He said he didn't even read it before he signed it. That didn't stop Bob from trying to use it in his appeals process, and he testified at a hearing that he believed the chief had a grudge against him due to that investigation from the 1990s. As for how Joseph would know about this to weave it into his story, Bob said Joseph knew about it because that's what happened. They had a grudge against him. I mean, it's also possible Joseph just added it in there for a little color, assuming that this professional Detroit-based landlord who paid him to have his wife killed must have some skeleton in his closet, and there just so happened to be some truth to that. Joseph's news story was deemed to be not credible, and Bob's appeal was denied. He appealed as much as he could, but the verdict was upheld at every level. On July 26, 2020, Bob Bashara was hospitalized and died 3 weeks later at the age of 62. His cause of death was not released by the prison, citing privacy laws. Of course, in the summer of 2020, there was the assumption that it must have been COVID-19, but the prison said there were no COVID cases in the prison Bob was at. A family member said that Bob had been on dialysis leading up to his death, so it seems like he may have had some ongoing health problems. Joseph Gens is still incarcerated and not eligible for parole until March 2029, when he will be 65 years old. If he serves his entire sentence, he will be 76 years old on release. As for Jane Bashara's loved ones, some have expressed that Bob dying just 8 years into his sentence was not nearly enough time behind bars to pay for what they lost when Jane was murdered. While the person who physically killed her will likely serve many, many years in prison, if not for Bob Bashara's decisions, Jane would be alive, and I can't imagine that there is ever enough time in prison to feel that that loss has been adequately compensated.